The Noxious Halberd is pretty good in PvP, but how is it in PVM? Also, is it worth the time to grind or the money to buy? In this video, we're going to be comparing it against different use cases and different weapons to see how it stacks up. It's got both stab and slash on it, so there's some stab cases with Zambi Spear, Dragon Hunter Lance, and Fang we'll need to compare. However, most of the cases are going to come in the slash style, where we're comparing it against Blade of Saeldor, Tent Whip, and Whip. We're not comparing it against Soul Reaper Axe or Scythe. Those are strictly better in 99% of the cases. They're more expensive, they take longer to grind. This is more of a stepping stone towards those weapons. We'll also need to factor in max gear versus a little bit more of a mid-game setup. Reason being, in max gear, faster weapons will do better, whereas in mid setups, slower weapons can do better. This Noxious Halberd is still pretty good in max setups, but I'll explain when the Blade of Saeldor might be better. That being said, the main thing we need to pay attention to is the nicheness it has. It has some extra poison and venom, but the one I'm talking about is the extra tile range. Everyone knows that halberds have extra range. There's some hidden things we might not have discovered yet. There might be some things in the video that might surprise you. These don't translate to DPS sheets sometimes, and it might be worth bringing this weapon over a little bit more DPS. I've killed a lot of Vardorvis. I wouldn't really drive for Soul Reaper Axe.
Wow, he really wasn't kidding. This is very dry.
The Noxious Halberd is actually really good here. It's better than a Tent Whip in all cases. It's only better than a Blade of Saeldor in like mid gear. In terms of special attack weapon, it being two-handed is good for stuff like Burning Claws, Dragon Claws, whereas if you bring Void Waker, you'll need a defender switch. In terms of hitting the boss, it's pretty standard, but one thing that's interesting is you can freeze him like that and then step to a tile and he can't hit you. It's glitchy, you know, he might dash and then you have to reposition. But the main thing I want to tell here is that this weapon is so interesting that it might have some hidden use cases we're not thinking about, and we need to be open to that in the future as well. One of the places where this weapon is actually okay is here at Grotesque Guardians. It's the same DPS as a Tent Whip pretty much across the board, and it's never really as good as a Blade of Saeldor. One of the benefits is during this special, you can attack from one tile out and not really miss ticks or dodge boulders a little bit better, a little bit more wiggle room. At the end of the kill, what you can do is you protect range here and stay one tile back. You can predict his attacks and take less off-style big hits, and that just overall will mitigate damage over time. If he ever gets close to you and walks up to you, you know to protect melee. Most of the time it's a melee attack, sometimes he'll throw another range attack, but at least you can overall mitigate more damage than normal. If he ever switches back to a range attack at this point, you can back up one tile and continue to get him, but it looks like he's just going to do melee there. So atop this is a decent weapon. Here at Maiden, it's okay, but Maiden gets drained pretty heavily, so overall it ends up being lower DPS than even a whip when she's drained. One thing that's nice about Maiden is if you gotta swap tanks, but you still want to deal your damage up close, you could back up one tile, and then somebody else who's here will be tanking instead of you, which is really nice. At Bloat, you'll treat it like a Scythe when it comes to getting your hits off. You do have a little bit of extra range, which can be beneficial. I like it here, when Bloat goes down because of the spacing, you might get closer to him with Noxious Halberd than you would with a melee weapon without the extra range. So here, let's see. Looks like we didn't get the extra hit there, but there are going to be some rotations where that does happen. Doing the melee roll here, what you can do is you can swap to the weapon when getting the big crabs, kind of like what you do with Scythe. Scythe gets 2 hit spots, this gets 1. It's actually pretty comparable. For the Nilo boss, it can be nice here because you can get 2 hits at a 5 tick, which you only get 2 with the Saeldor anyways, and then when it switches to a weaker style like Mage, you're not losing DPS as much. It's decent at Sotoseg. It's basically as Blade of Saeldor. You typically want to stay in melee range because otherwise it'll spawn a lot of balls. This guy you can see is outside of melee range, so every single time balls are being spawned, which makes this fight more difficult. Wow, so this room is actually pretty easy with this. You don't have to do any running as long as you're not in the tiles that you don't want to scuff. You stand back one tile and just move to a new space, and look at this. I mean, I'm doing pretty good here and not scuffing any tiles and barely moving. For this last phase, of course, you are using a 5-tick weapon, so the timing is a little bit tighter, so be careful for that. For Verzik, when you're running in, you actually get in one tile earlier, which is kind of good because you actually get one more tick of forgiveness. P2 is obviously one of the great areas. You never have to worry about getting bounced. You can just walk side to side. Makes this part very easy. You can also take out these purple crabs in one hit. For P3, what I really like is if somebody else is tanking, you could stay back one tile. You never have to worry about an accidental melee, which is honestly can save your life. Also for webs, compared to Blade of Saeldor, webs is a 5-tick timing, so you're actually getting more DPS from this than you would from a Blade of Saeldor. Turns out the Noxious Halberd is really good at Theater of Blood. You can use it in every room, and while it's not a Blade of Saeldor level strength in most cases, the utility and the extra ease you get from using it, I think, might make it rise above for some players, especially for learners. I think where it really shines is Zarpus for the melee method, making that really easy to do. P2 Verzik not getting bounced is awesome, and P3, never taking an accidental melee, is huge. On top of that, running webs at a 5-tick is going to be better than running webs with a 4-tick weapon. Corp is one I'm very excited to talk about. We're going to start with the easy notes. If you're using the full drain method and you're using Azami Hasa, this is better. So you can start using this instead. Now, if we're trying to compare this to the Fang method, where you lower the defense slightly and then hit with the Fang and Void Wakers, this isn't as good. That being said, that method is specifically when you're using Elder Maul 2 or 3 times. This starts to get better than a Fang after more defense has been reduced after that. So I'm thinking there might be a hidden meta here that people don't know about, and it probably warrants its own video. So I'm just going to quickly show it off. What you can do is you can come in here, and you're going to first try to land 2 Elder Maul specs. Okay, there's one. Let's go for the second one. Okay, so we got both of them off, which is really good. Going to come over here now. And now, what I want to use is the tonsicles of Ralos.
Wow, he really just said that. That's not even close at all.
Reason being, the Elder Maul is now doing diminishing defense reduction each time, whereas these are always going to reduce his defense by 70, which is equal to like the second Elder Maul. So we're looking for double hit splats. We got 2 there, which is really good. So he's pretty low defense, and they both hit there. Perfect. What's interesting now is he's actually got his defense to 0. This is where we can start doing the Fang method, but instead of using Fang, we're using a higher DPS method. So we're going to use our 2 Void Wakers. Right? Big hit there. Big hit there. And then we're going to obviously switch to our Halberd and start doing our dodges. This could end up being better than Fang. I think it needs more testing. If not, it's probably going to be very similar, but I wanted to show it off. It's still the early days. Very excited to see where this can go in the future.
Wow, he really went at them. That's really lucky.
If you're interested in melee Colosseum, this is a decent option if you don't have a Soul Reaper or a Scythe, of course. It's got the extra range, but the extra range is going to be short-lived because you're going to be taking Myopia. That being said, if you're doing one of your first quivers or your farming quivers with range or mage, you're going to need a slash weapon for Soul Heretic, and in my opinion, this is a really good weapon for that. Reason being, if you're bringing a Blade of Saeldor, you're going to need an Avernic, which is an extra inventory space. But on top of that, most of the time when you're running a mage or range set, you don't bring a full max setup for melee. So this Noxious Halberd, even if you did have a Avernic, is going to be more DPS than a Blade anyway, so you might as well take this and save the space. The only thing is, you do want to take Myopia, because you don't want to have this weapon be really difficult to use at Soul Heretic with the extra range. It's going to be more of a detriment. When you are tri-breeding DKs, this is a pretty good option to use. It's always equal to or better than Tent Whip in all setups. It's only better than Blade in mid-game setups. An extra little fact here is that he can be poisoned, which is really helpful. You could use a spec to get rid of the poison here, but it's not worth it. It's better to use an antidote and save your spec for something like Sarah Sword or a DPS spec. Really good here at Eclipse Moon because you can put it in stab, and because of the armor mechanic, slower weapons are actually better here. It's also pretty good if you put it on slash at Blood Moon as well, if you want to use it at 2 of the places. The last thing I want to mention here is it's got really, really high base strength, which makes it absolutely devastating during the rebound special here, similar to that of an Elder Maul. So if we look here, let's just look at these hits. We can get this guy down probably to 0, no problem here. There's a 47, there's a 42. It's only got 27 health left, and he's dead. This weapon can be effective in Slayer in general, especially when you're safe spotting, but a couple areas I really like it are at Wyrms and Drakes. Reason being is these attack with 2 styles, so if you just stand back here and protect mage, you'll never take damage, so it means you'll never have to bank. This also means you can bring full strength here as opposed to mage defense, or you can even bring something like proselyte or something like that, just to not use any prayer really. This is really, really good. It's never better than a Dragon Hunter Lance, so if you've gotten that, you probably want to use that. But, you know, if you don't want to bank, maybe you bring this instead. The other thing is, in terms of compared to Blowpipe or Dragon Hunter Crossbow for Drakes, it's better in mid-game setups, but it's obviously at max setups, Blowpipe and Dragon Hunter is going to be better. But you're not using ammo, which is really good. And Drakes are basically the exact same thing, except you protect range, all the same notes. Here, though, you would bring strength gear if you're using Dragon Hunterland, so it's up to you again, but I just wanted to quickly show this off. This is really good. And against the superiors, this is safer too, because you don't have to worry about the superiors clapping you out for either the Wyrms or these guys. For a lot of combat achievements that require you to use a melee weapon that would be typically more dangerous, this can be an easy way to kind of make it a lot easier if you're not too comfortable. So fight caves, you know, melee fight caves, the triple challenge where you got to use melee for one of them. This is a way where you can stay back and you don't have to worry as much about taking the melee hits. This applies to other combat achievements in places like TOA and potentially future combat achievements. There are a lot of places where I tested this and I want to share it just in case you guys are thinking about it, but at these places it didn't end up being that great, or it ended up being really bad. Muttadile is weak to stab, the big one and the small one, so I thought it could be good there. It only really works when they're frozen, and it's just easier to bring a Blowpiper or Bofa. Vasa Crystals, it's good because it's weak against stab, but you probably have another option in. Maybe if you really didn't, you could bring it, sure. Pandos is an interesting one because I wore full tank melee Travag gear, and I would protect mage, so I would take no damage from the mage minion and no damage from the other minions, and then for Bandos I would freeze him with ZGS and then back up and take no damage from him. It felt really good. I was taking no damage from really anything until he unfroze, and then I didn't have enough freezes to really keep him there, and it just doesn't work. In a group though, it could work. If you have enough DPS to take him down in one freeze, it could be a fun option to make it really easy. Lizardman Shaman are weak, very weak to stab. Thought it could be good there. The purple crabs ruin it because you got to back up from the purple crabs, and then when you run back in sometimes you'll take a melee hit. It's hard to keep the spacing properly, and they're jumping everywhere. And then if you want to use a spec to cure poison, they re-poison you. It doesn't work. Mole on paper could be okay, but there's too many good options. You can kill Mole with Bofa, T-Bow, Fang, Darox, Shadows. Those are all better. Here we got a bunch of demons. Problem here is Emberlight and Arclight are demon bane weapons that do better. They're both slash and stab, just like Noxious Halberd. So it's competing with those, and it's just never really going to win. And then you have Scorching Bow on top of that for Krill. At Duke, however, Duke is only 70% demon bane, so I thought maybe it could work there. Plus, Duke can be poisoned, so get a little bit extra poison damage. Plus, he attacks at a 5-tick cycle, which the Noxious Halberd does, so you can do that until the enrage phase. Problem is, when you attack him and then you back up, you re-attack him, you don't go into melee range, so you take a mage hit. The only way to stop that is to, after every attack, you have to manually click to go back in and then attack Duke, which is a lot of extra attacks, or you got to run back 2 tiles, and then when you click Duke, you run in 2 tiles, and then you get into melee range, no problem, but then you're using run energy. Overall, it's probably easier to just use Emberlight the whole kill, and really you'd only use it if you didn't have that over maybe Zombie Axe. So is this weapon worth it to grind or buy? It depends, obviously, and hopefully the video helps it for your specific account, but I would say generally, yeah, it's probably worth it, especially if you don't have a Soul Reaper or a Scythe. Its power level is very similar to that of, I would say, mostly a Tent Whip. At times it is kind of like a Blade of Saeldor, but the main thing here is its extra utility from the extra range could end up being really valuable, where you could get more DPS out of it or avoid damage, and it could end up being better than a Blade of Saeldor. And it's two-handed, which is a really good benefit, and it can occasionally poison things, which is a tiny benefit. Probably won't end up being too expensive either. It'll be cheaper than a Saeldor by a significant amount. The only way it won't be cheaper than a Saeldor is if some crazy thing comes out in the future where this is going to be really good there specifically because of the extra range, but until then, this is going to be a good price. And while a 10 whip is cheaper, it does use charges, and having something with infinite charges always feels good. It's not a long grind either, too, so if you want to grind this for yourself, really you might get it passively when going for a Rancor, and it's much shorter than a Blade of Saeldor. I hope you enjoyed some of this. Some of the use cases, like I loved it at Tob, mostly for learners. It's going to be really good. Corp, Moons, and a bunch of other places. I think what I'm most excited for is future content. I'm always going to be thinking of this weapon because you never know when it's going to have some crazy use case that comes out where it's going to be really valuable.